I don't use the word hero very often, but one of my heroes died a week plus ago on October 25th. John Taylor Gatto died, and I am compelled to say a few words. So here we go. It's about 12 years ago I was exposed to John Taylor Gatto's work. I had actually read a graphic novel called Nightly News, and in that comic, Gatto's work had come out because what the writer had put out there with regard to American people and their willingness to be sheep and just follow mainstream media. There's a graph of two things. One of them is the decline of SAT scores, and the parallel graph, the SAT score graph going down, and stock price in Novartis going up. And I may not be remembering it exactly, but these odd kind of coincidences always strike me. And the author made reference to John Taylor Gatto's Underground History of American Education. And that was unique to me. I had never heard of John Taylor Gatto, and I had been teaching at that point 10 years. So it was unique that I would, History of American Education, this is pretty intriguing. And then there's the comic book writer had mentioned the stock price of Novartis, of all things. And what it was, of course, was the ADHD diagnoses that are out there and the drugs that are created to fix the diagnoses of ADHD. And apparently either the author of the comic book either tied Gatto to it, or this guy, John Taylor Gatto, was looking at these exterior things and tying it to the history of school. And I remember thinking, well, there's always been school. What do you mean the history of school and the history of school in America? And then I started thinking about it. I'm like, wait a minute, hold on. Now, this is 2006. So I went to a search engine and typed in John Taylor Gatto, and I saw some videos. There was a Real Player video of John Taylor Gatto, and it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 hours long, and I started watching it. And I believe it was called The Purpose of School or The Purpose of Schooling. It might have been called The Fourth Purpose. I'm not 100% sure. It's an old Real Player video, and Gatto is sitting there with like a palm tree and a tropical scene behind him that's obviously fake. And he introduces himself, and he starts talking about school. And I watched the entire thing. I could not take my eyes off of the screen because it wasn't. And it was just an older guy with gray hair talking about school. And I was mesmerized by it. And the reason why I was so taken by it was because I had never heard these ideas, never heard about this research, never heard anything about school in the way that he had done it. In the approach that he had taken. And I'd been a student in public school since 1977, graduated high school in 1990, started teaching high school students in 1996, and by then I had been teaching high school students for 10 years, and I had heard about none of this stuff. And what did he say that was so earth-shattering? Well, basically that there wasn't always a school. There wasn't certainly any kind of taxpayer-funded, mandatory, compulsory brand of schooling. And not only had there not always been that, but the people who introduced it, and they said this isn't some kind of theory, the people who introduced school took the idea from Prussia and said, well, if Prussia can do this with its population during wartime and consequently during peacetime, we too can do this with the American population. Now, the American population had been a free people. There was no compulsory taxpayer-funded school, which I did not know. The last state to implement it by force was, I believe, I don't know which state was, but it was in the early 1900s. Think about that. So there was no mandatory school. You didn't really go to school but for a little bit of time to learn some basics if you decided. And the number of people who went to no school is practically everybody. So people were free. You were on a gold standard. The federal government was tiny. There was no income tax. There were no unions to speak of. And you had an explosion of literacy. And the examples that Gatto used in his book, The Underground History of American Education, that I use today are two. One of them is Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Now, you should pick up Common Sense and read it. You can find it for free on the internet. About a fifth, maybe more, maybe a fourth of the population, when you look at the sales figures, I want to say it sold 500,000 to 600,000, maybe as small as 300,000 copies, but the population of the American colonies at the time was only 3 million people. So you have this pamphlet that is written called Common Sense, and it sells like crazy. Imagine a third, a fourth, or a fifth of the United States buying anything now. Huge percentage. Well, pick up Common Sense and read it. It's not easy to read. It's complicated. So if there was no compulsory school and people weren't going to school starting at age 4 or 5 and being in a school until age 18, how are they able to read it? How are they able to handle that kind of language, which you can look at? After this video is over, go get Thomas Paine's Common Sense and look at it. The other example he uses in his book, The Underground History of American Education, and in other places, is Last of the Mohicans, James Fenimore Cooper. Have you read it? It is complicated, difficult, nuanced, entertaining, and layered. It came out, I want to say, in the 1820s. I want to say 1823, but you can check. It, too, is available for next to no price. It's probably in the bargain bin at Barnes & Noble. In the classics, those gigantic classics books where you get 4 books for $16. And it sold like crazy. It was a bestseller. Again, how is that possible? Take Last of the Mohicans and its literacy level and difficulty level. Take it, buy it, read it, and then you explain to me, without using any weasel words whatsoever, how did an American population that in effect was free, I mean, you didn't have the things now. You wanted to open up a store, you opened up a store. You didn't get a license. You wanted to cut hair, you just did it. You wanted to sell books, sell books. You want to be a printer like Benjamin Franklin became, you do that. Whatever you wanted to do, you did. It didn't always work. You could fail. And if you failed, you had to deal with it. There was no Social Security. There was no public assistance. There was no, what do they call it now? A social safety net. Not through the government, through the churches and the communities, sure. Through friendly societies, yes. But not through government. And so you have this society that we're told was some kind of Darwinian hellhole of difficulty. Cruel and awful. Without the government there to help us. Without school there to teach our children. And yet you have something like a book like Last of the Mohicans selling out. Can you explain that? I don't think you can without making irrational guesses and using 27 different kinds of weasel words and making assumptions that you don't know the answer to, that you've done no research for. Yet that's how it went. And here's the other part of Gatto's work that's eye-opening, that really should make you, and you as a teenager or any parent, stand up and take notice. The amazing literacy that was prevalent back in the old days, particularly but not exclusively among the elites. They still do that at the private boarding schools. The main thing in the purpose of schooling, that video that I was telling you, was Gatto researched what do the private boarding schools teach. And the reason why he did that is when you notice where the presidential candidates, and I think he uses the 2000 and the 2004 federal elections as evidence, but you can look at all of them. You don't need just those two. Those candidates went to St. Philip's Exeter Academy. They went to St. Albans. They went to Choate. They went to these Hotchkiss. They go to these Kent. They go to these private boarding schools. And these places combined, what are there? I think they're about 20 top schools. Combined, push out a few thousand graduates a year. Combined, because each one is pretty small. Yet, at the top of the presidential candidate heap, they all went to the same high schools. Forget about college. That's easy. They all went to Harvard and Yale. So Gatto notices this and he says, well, what do they teach? What do they do that the public schools, that the regular folk, the proles, don't get? And he comes up with a list of over a dozen things that they all mandate. And it's an interesting list. Public speaking is one of those things. Rigorous physical sports, not necessarily team sports, but some individual sport, wrestling maybe, horseback riding. Things that are tough, that are difficult. You have to do that at these schools. How our systems are built and how to navigate through them is also part of the private boarding school tradition. And those students, in addition to those kinds of things, they'll read things like Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, which tells you that power is never, ever where you think it is. That those people are props. That the real power is somewhere else. Probably in the shadows behind the curtain, behind the person that you think is in power. They also read things like Caesar's Gallic Wars, which you can get, again, I checked it out online the other day. I found it instantly, and it's for free on the internet. I printed up chapters 1 and 2 of book 1. And Gallic Wars teaches you about how to divide and conquer. How does a small force defeat a much larger in number force? Gallic Wars gives you chapter and verse on that. I can't think of a book more appropriate today than that, as our overlords and the cloud people are dividing us by race. They're doing that now. It's what you're watching, at least I see it, and I think others are starting to as well, is, I mean, go on social media. On Facebook, I learn every day that white people are terrible. Those people weren't saying that 15 years ago, 10 years ago, but they're saying it now. The divide and conquer stuff works. In my day, it was class. We were taught to hate capitalists and hate the wealthy. And hopefully the rich would die off. And they're greedy. All that kind of stuff. The divide and conquer, where did that plan come from? Where's the guidebook for that? It's in Caesar's Gallic Wars. And you can read it, and they're reading it up at the private boarding schools. They're also reading things like Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, which teaches you that anything you have to buy is worthless, and anything that is valuable to you pretty much is free. You have the most powerful, most wealthy emperor, arguably on the history of the planet, and he tells you his philosophy. And where are they reading that at your child's school? No. Are you reading the Gallic Wars in 6th grade? No, you're not reading it at all. And John Taylor Gatto actually tells you that when he was in school, post-World War II, he was in 6th grade. They got assigned Caesar's Gallic Wars in 6th grade. You're 12 in 6th grade. So Gatto's work is this factual romp through the industry of school and what the people were saying when they started school. And when you have the French and the Germans battling in Jena, and the French defeat the Germans, the Prussians, and the Prussians are wondering why. Why did their soldiers run away from those bullets? And Gatto explains that it woke the Prussians up and said, wait a minute, our people aren't just following orders and running into gunfire like the French did. We need to change that. And they realized what they needed to do: take young people away from their families, put them somewhere for so long that they become true believers in their government and the system. And that's what we have now. High school is 2 million minutes long. Primary school, you start at kindergarten at age 4, earlier if it's pre-K. Where aren't you? You're not at home with the people who know you best, the people who can understand you best and probably teach you best. And I know you can come up with all kinds of reasons why both parents aren't in the house and why you need to put your child somewhere to go to school. Look, I'm 46. You can't come up with a counter proposal. But here's the thing. It wasn't always that way. Not very long ago, and Gatto mentions this too, not very long ago, you had people with one income living in a house in the suburbs, and you had generally mothers staying home taking care of children. And you really have to wonder, who put the information out there that that was somehow bad? Why is mom staying home raising children, at least for the first few years of their lives? Why is that such a terrible thing? And why is it now very difficult for a mother who wants to do that to survive on just one income? And she can't. She has to put her child somewhere else to get taught, brainwashed, indoctrinated. Maybe it's just taught. Remember, Gatto is really good at explaining to you that the people who created school, they were not beasts. They were not animals. They were not demons. They felt that to create the best society, you needed, experts needed to take children away from their homes because they were doing a job that the experts in society could do better. So we have to take those children away from their parents who were doing a flawed job teaching and raising their children and give them to the scientifically trained experts who got their PhDs in Germany, Prussia, to educate the children. And the standard bearer for this idea is Columbia Teachers College, which my physics teacher, track coach at high school said had done more to damage education and school than any other institution on earth. And I didn't know at the time what he was talking about, but now I do. So what happened was you have John Taylor Gatto ripping the cover off of the origins of school and explaining that because school for us, for the regular people, has completely imploded and become at times worse than useless, he not only covers the origins of school itself, but he goes into what has happened to school in the modern day. And it is somewhat frightening when you think about it, because now you have these buildings of emptiness that don't do much more than indoctrinate. And it's become the new religion. An offshoot of John Taylor Gatto's work is a group of huge numbers of people on the internet and other places like me who understand that school is the new religion. Go to a group and say, you know what, I think maybe we should end this school experiment. Or maybe we should abolish compulsory taxpayer-funded school and it should all be private. Say something bad about a teachers' union. It would be like going into a religious colony and saying something bad about their deity. You go into an evangelical Christian community and talk badly about Jesus Christ. It's the same reaction. It's the same thing. And it is assumed that school is just by default good. And not only is it good, it needs your money. It wasn't always like that. And what Gatto was able to do through his books, and I recommend his books, his lectures on YouTube, there are tons of them out there, is to understand how school got started. And if you can do that, if you can do what John Taylor Gatto did, who changed my thinking forever, it will really send you to an intellectually rich place, because you'll start to do, if nothing else, you'll start to ask the question, if it wasn't always this way, how did it work before? And did it work before? Maybe it didn't. Maybe the current way is better. But at the very least, you're saying, especially when it comes to raising children, was it better before? Is the quote-unquote new way, or this established way, is it truly the best thing for children? Your children or others? And that's what Gatto did to my mind. The teacher I was before I got to him is very different than a teacher I am now. I even had a former student of mine, Crystal, on Facebook. I was talking about certain things and saying certain things, and she said, and this, Crystal was a student of mine back when I was at Monroe High School in the late 1990s. And she said, we didn't learn any of this stuff when you were our teacher. And I said, you're right. I didn't go this route back then, because I didn't know then what I know now. And the most radical difference for me, the biggest switch in my thought process and my role as an educator, is the introduction to John Taylor Gatto. And his influence on me has been incredible. And then it has therefore trickled down to the probably 2,000 or so students who've come through my room since then, which really shows you that when you ask, what can one person do? What can one person do? Well, look at John Taylor Gatto. You can do what he did. That's what you can do. Talk to you next time.